It is an honor and a privilege to be with you here this morning. Most of you know me, and if you don't, you will. I've been a priest in this diocese for a little over 20 years, and except for 4.5 years in the wilderness of Seattle, all of my ministry has been in this Metro East convocation. I was rector here from 2009 to 2014. Most recently, I served for the past 3.5 years as the rector of Saints Peter and Paul, which closed its doors as a church on December 31st. There are a lot of reasons this happened, and it was a long time in coming. The short version is that it is next to impossible for a poor church in a poor diocese to survive if our mission is to serve poor people. Several of you were at our final service and supported Saints Peter and Paul in other ways, and that has been a great blessing. Part of my background is that I did not grow up in the church or with any religious tradition. I first came across this passage that we just heard as a 20-something sort of feminist whose coursework at the time required me to read a bunch of feminist liberation theology. It was the mid-'80s. When I encountered this story, like many of my peers, I was outraged. Can you believe this? Jesus heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law from illness, and immediately she has to get up and fix them dinner? Typical. That's terrible, right? That interpretation, while itself typical, is not entirely accurate. Simon's mother-in-law, and I don't want to keep referring her that way, so let's give her a name. Let's call her Margaret. Margaret may have felt well enough to get up and make everyone dinner, but that was unlikely her role in the household of her daughter and her daughter's husband. Nor is it the heart of this story about her healing. In the ancient Mediterranean, one's state of being and sense of self was more important than one's ability to function. The work of a healer, like Jesus, was to restore or transform a person's sense of self and sense of their place in the world. Margaret is not healed so that she can function around the house, but so that she can inhabit the world in a new way. The heart of this story, which is also our story, is Margaret's grateful response to Jesus's intervention in her life. She gets up to serve as a disciple, to serve with Jesus and alongside his closest disciples. The whole arc of Mark's gospel can be summed up by words that we hear much later. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. This is the kind of service Margaret is called to, and we are called to. Serving as a disciple who pulls back the veil on the reign of God is her grateful response to the encounter with the holy. What if we understood all of Scripture and all of our own lives as a call and response with God? We might consider today's reading from Isaiah to be a call and response. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Those who wait for the Lord shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The prophet always calls God's people to faithful response. Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is not in today's readings, but I'm always going to bring her up. The prophetic song of Mary is Mary's response to what God has done for her and what she perceives that God is doing for the world. It is her song of promise, continuing the story that Isaiah tells of God's strengthening the weak-hearted, giving courage to the fearful, renewing those who suffer. You will all hear more on another day about the new mission of St. Mary the Prophet that is starting this year in East Portland. This is a new community of neighbors living unsheltered who, try as we might, do not find spiritual shelter in traditional church. This project of St. Mary the Prophet is funded in a small way, for starters, by the Episcopal Church Office of New Episcopal Communities. I like to think that the Episcopal Church's grateful response to what God has done in Jesus is to seed communities serving those who have historically been underserved and marginalized by the church. Mary the Prophet is part of the great story of call and response, the story that includes Isaiah's people and Margaret and the first disciples and each one of us. My friend Crystal, whom a couple of you have met and whom I hope more of you will meet, has a beautiful story of call and response, and she gave me permission to share it with you. She tells it better than me, but I will give you the elevator version. Crystal experienced a 20-year opiate addiction and was on the streets of Portland most of that time. Near the end, she had racked up quite a few criminal charges that she thought were irrefutable. She came very close to ending her life because she saw no other direction. When, by God's grace and the love of Jesus, she realized that she wanted to live, she was prepared to turn herself in. When she did, the prosecuting attorney looked at her and said, "I don't have enough evidence to charge you." She is still mystified at how this happened because she knew that it was not true. This was, in her experience, a miracle and also a calling. Her response was to go out into her neighborhood with a big pot of soup and reach out to people who are living outside and suffering. This was the beginning of what is now a wonderful, expansive, life-giving nonprofit organization that is spreading love and grace throughout East Portland. We don't all have such dramatic call and response stories, but we all have them. I have experienced the grateful response of people who were regularly served by ministries at Saints Peter and Paul. People with no resources would come over to clean up the parking lot or to bring little gifts that they thought we might want or need. My favorite response are the people, and I know several, who it was their job to make sure that nobody swore on or near the church grounds. Hey, don't talk that way. This is a church. These friends, like Margaret, like Crystal, like Mary the prophet, experienced in big and small ways the radical love of God. Love that goes to the root of what it means to love and to be loved. Radical love that calls us to join Jesus in transforming the world into the kingdom. We, too, in this place, in this moment, are immersed in that radical love of God and are called by that radical love. And so the question, of course, is how shall we respond?